Mena Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Think Tank.
Welcome to Mena-Talk. The topic of our conversation today is a historical novel, and I do believe this is a first for Mena, our program here. My esteemed conversation partner is Vladimir Vertlib, who was born in 1966 in the Russian city of Leningrad. At the age of 5 years, he relocated with his entire family to Israel, then to the Netherlands, then to the USA, to Italy, and then when he was 15 years old, he eventually made his way to Austria and decided to stay there permanently. The title of this fascinating and compelling new novel by Vladimir Vertlib is called The Jewess of the Empress. And my first question is this. How did you come to be so fascinated with the figure of the Empress? Was it because of her virulent hatred of Jews, or an extremely unhappy and short life? Or perhaps the Velázquez paintings at the Kunsthistorisches Museum, or even all of these elements combined?
It was indeed the latter. Originally, it was the paintings in the Kunsthistorisches Museum. You see, as a child and a teenager, even when I was already living in Austria, I often found myself spending my weekends in various museums. Back then, you could use your student ID to visit many museums in Vienna for free up to a certain age, and so I also went. And I'd go, which is rather unusual for a 13 or 14-year-old, to the Kunsthistorisches Museum and spend time admiring many of the paintings. What impressed me most were those childhood and adolescent portraits of Margarita Teresa, painted by Velázquez. Of course, back then, I actually didn't know anything about the life story of this young woman, you see. I already knew that Velázquez was a great Spanish painter. We also covered that in school, and I was deeply impressed by how, even if I couldn't have articulated it quite that way at the time, these paintings were so profoundly psychologically insightful and dramatically captivating in their character portrayal. They truly depicted deep psychological aspects. So it was truly possible to put oneself in this person's shoes, and one could almost palpably feel the tremendous tension she was under even as an observer watching from a distance. And it was only much later that I began to ponder who exactly was this young woman after all. One hears so much about the painter, but nothing about the woman he painted or the young woman, the girl he captured on canvas. And so I began to do some research, and that's when I first stumbled upon her story. It deeply shocked me because this young woman at just 15 years old was married off from Spain to Austria to her uncle Leopold, who was the Archduke of Austria. And she then passed away at the young age of 21 and a half after enduring her 7th pregnancy. Most of her children died. That was when it became clear to me that someday I wanted to write something about her, and so I began my research. And only then did it truly become clear to me just how anti-Semitic this young woman was in her thinking, how profoundly she was shaped by the Spaniards influenced by the Inquisition. It was a profound and stark realization, and that she was the actual driving force behind the 1670 expulsion of Jews from the so-called Jewish quarter in today's Leopoldstadt. That's how it happened.
I would like to begin by referencing a sermon that was given by Bishop Kolonich. He is a historical figure. He actually existed. He gave his sermon in the Augustiner Kirche, which served as the Viennese court church, and that sermon was explicitly dedicated to the hatred of Jews. And the Empress Margarita Teresa was absolutely delighted. Emperor Leopold, however, was not as enthusiastic. You vividly portray his reaction in your novel, and I'd like to quote it for everyone here. "What an utter scoundrel," the emperor thinks to himself. "But what am I to do? Without these foolish scoundrels, my empire could not hold together. though I would much prefer to let them simply speak their minds. Instead of such sermons, I would much rather hear the howls and shrieks of this bishop as his bones are shattered on the breaking wheel. The emperor, you see, he doesn't exactly favor this hatred of Jews, but then again he doesn't particularly care for Jews themselves either. Would you say that sums it up quite accurately?
Absolutely. The emperor, of course, was also a man of his era, and he too was influenced by this counter-reformation, this intensely Catholic movement. Very, very Catholic society, Austria. He himself was a Habsburg with profound Spanish roots, much like his wife, Margarita Teresa, who in turn possessed her own distinct Austrian heritage. This means that these two empires were very, very closely connected at that time. And that was truly a time characterized by deeply ingrained prejudice, by an intense hatred of Jewish people. Back then, within the circles we are currently discussing, it was simply taken for granted that Jews were responsible for crucifying Jesus, that they somehow embodied evil itself, that they were truly of the devil. But the emperor himself is in fact a rather gentle soul, so this specific passage you read, the fantasy I ascribe to him in the novel, isn't actually very characteristic of him, because fundamentally he was first and foremost an artist, a musician. And his works are well known, they are still performed today. And he would have loved to become a priest or a monk and also a musician more than anything else in the world. But then his older brother passed away, and that's how he ended up becoming Archduke and Emperor. And naturally he also adopts all the prevailing prejudices, but fundamentally he doesn't actually wish any harm upon anyone. And he tries to get along with everyone. He also knows that he needs the Jews for economic reasons. He is not a fanatic in the same way his wife is.
Leopold I reigned for a full half-century, spanning the latter half of the 17th century, and he's widely recognized as the Austrian emperor of the opulent Baroque era. Yet, he simultaneously holds the title of the emperor responsible for the expulsion of Jews from Vienna, and the Viennese people remain grateful to him for this action. The name Leopoldstadt, referring to what is now Vienna's second municipal district, directly derives from that historic expulsion. And in the novel, it states that the Viennese rather enjoyed witnessing the expulsion, because they viewed it as a particularly amusing spectacle. This implies the hatred of Jews was actually a Christian standard, but not just in the upper class.
Yes, the people back then were, and that for me was quite surprising. What was both surprising and, on the other hand, so deeply unsettling during my research for this novel was how people back then were similarly agitated and held similar prejudices as they would later in 1938. There are indeed definite connections. They insulted, spat on, and mocked the Jews during this expulsion. And it was precisely this, yes, naturally, the lower class also harbored the anti-Semitism of the common man or woman. Perhaps one could formulate it that casually in such a manner.
And it wasn't just in Vienna.
No.
I want to read a specific sentence from the novel, which goes like this. Is there a single Jewish family that cannot count among its members at least one martyr, one victim slain, maimed, or burned by the Gentiles? And this holds true from Spain to Russia.
Yes.
And I think that this is actually stored in the historical Jewish memory, and it's something that, it's not something that people just forget about. It may well be unconscious, but when a massacre occurs, it can instantly trigger an alarm within the collective memory.
Even as a relatively small child, when I was only 6 or 7 years old, I already knew that the Shoah had indeed taken place. From that age, or perhaps even younger, I was already aware of it. Perhaps it was unconscious before, but ever since I was 6, 7, 8 years old, I've known more or less what the Jewish people have gone through over the last 2,000 years. Maybe not in every detail, but that we are exposed, that we were expelled, persecuted and killed. And it was always clear to me, especially when I was in Austria, what happened here. If I had been born just 21 years earlier, they probably would have thrown me as a baby straight into an oven here. I was aware of that by the time I was about 10. And if one looks back at history now, particularly the time I'm describing, there are, so to speak, two absolutely pivotal moments, if I may detail them, that are utterly crucial for understanding the profound fear that Jews still experience today, whether in the diaspora or in Israel. We are well aware of the kind of times we are living in. On the one hand, Spain, where even during Margarita Teresa's era, there existed a blood certificate, a limpieza de sangre, a sort of documentation akin to the Aryan certificate later employed by the Nazis, demanded of individuals seeking positions in civil service or simply aspiring to a certain standing, who wanted to move in certain circles, were required to prove they had no Jewish ancestors, no Jewish and no Moorish, meaning no Muslim ancestors. And it didn't matter whether they were baptized or not, so it was a purely racist concept. It is often said that in those days the hatred for Jews was purely religious, not stemming from their ancestry or background. That's simply not accurate. It was, of course, very often and for a very, very long time about their origins and not solely about their religion. That's a crucial point. And the second one is, and I do describe this too because one of the main characters here, Esther, a midwife, originally comes from what is now Ukraine, and she experienced a horrific pogrom there. And this particular pogrom, or rather these pogroms, orchestrated by Bohdan Khmelnytsky, a Cossack leader who at that time fought against Polish rule, cost hundreds of thousands of Jewish lives. It was practically a first Shoah. Something that hardly anyone in this country still knows about. That occurred between 1648 and approximately 1654. That was, so to speak, the time frame. And I recall my grandmother once told me, my very own grandmother, that her grandmother, who was born and grew up in the 19th century, when she spoke of something truly awful, she would invariably say, that was das war, in Yiddish, das war in Khmelnytsky's Yorn, referring to the time of Khmelnytsky. And my grandmother never understood what in Khmelnytsky's Yorn meant. It wasn't until much later, when she was older, that she finally researched it and discovered it referred to the years of Khmelnytsky, specifically the terrible, devastating years of Khmelnytsky. As I said, 1648, 1650, and we're already at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. That's how deeply ingrained it is. So I'm now making the connection back to what you had said and asked earlier. Yes, that's how profoundly it's embedded within the subconscious, and quite often it's very much present on a conscious level as well.
The emperor, to return to him for a moment, doesn't actually wish to expel the Jews. However, he eventually yields to pressure, giving in to the constant insistence and relentless nagging of his wife, so that he could finally have some peace and quiet. And this wife, Margarita Teresa, due to the incessant intermarrying between the royal houses of Madrid and Vienna, is both his first cousin and his niece, all at the same time. Even during their marriage, she continually addresses him as uncle. And it is 7 pregnancies, tragically ending in miscarriages and heartbreaking stillbirths. One daughter, just one, manages to survive childhood, yet there is no male heir to secure the throne. And she passes away at 21.5 years old, having been perpetually ill throughout her life. It is a terrible life indeed, but one lived in absolute luxury.
It was also important for me to demonstrate that the destinies of women from that time across all social strata, ranging from the princess, whom one would assume was raised amidst luxury, with every single desire fulfilled, to the most humble of individuals, illustrating that such experiences spanned all levels of society. Poorest of the poor, and indeed the poorest of the poor are present in the novel, as are women who endure immense suffering from numerous childbirths and the harsh realities of poverty. It really illustrates that all these women's lives at that time were truly dire and profoundly dictated by external forces. Even Empress Margarita Theresa, who you'd think would have it all, who despite her expensive clothing and numerous servants actually held very little real power or influence within that society.
And her one and only mission, her entire purpose in life, is to bear an heir to the throne. And that's exactly what fails to happen. One boy dies at just 2 months old or so, and the other is born, takes a single gasp of breath, and then he's gone.
Yes, child mortality was quite high back then, even in that social class. Even there, probably 2 out of 3 children died. In their first year of life, that was perfectly normal. Normal, in quotation marks. Something that this poor young woman simply cannot manage to achieve herself, even if she desperately tries. And naturally, she doesn't question any of that. She doesn't question her role as a woman in that society, not even in the slightest. Sometimes she rebels a little in her imagination, but ultimately she has to find scapegoats for it. She has to find someone who is to blame, and the Jews are to blame. The fact that they live here, that is the reason God is punishing her, and that is the reason she can't bear a healthy heir to the throne.
I get the impression, when reading the novel, her anti-Semitism is her only source of solace, as she attributes all her misfortunes to the Jewish people. Furthermore, she perceives her fervent hatred of them as a virtuous, devout act.
Yes, absolutely. And the ambivalence of it all, the sheer absurdity in this situation, is that her personal physician, Pedro Esteban de Rojas, is himself of Jewish origin. He was a converted Jew, mind you.
We'll get to him.
We'll get there.
We'll be returning to him shortly. I'd like to just remain on the Catholic side of the Viennese court for a little while longer. The ladies in waiting, the ones whose names you mention explicitly in your novel. I looked it up. They really existed. They're historical figures, even though they don't appear much more in the novel. This means your research was incredibly thorough, and I'd imagine that was quite a lengthy undertaking.
I also have, in the back there's also I'll mention later.
An acknowledgement.
Yes, it is an acknowledgement, a dedication to a variety of different people. So it's very important to me to mention historian retired Professor Dr. H.C. Thomas Winkelbauer, to mention him. He helped me a lot. Then Claudia Erdheim, who wrote a book about this Jewish quarter. She worked very differently than I did, but I was very inspired by the Jewish quarter from Claudia Erdheim, an author I greatly admire. I had a lot of proofreaders who were a big help to me, and naturally I did my own research. I read extensively, and of course I already possessed the practical skills needed to bypass certain perilous traps within a novel. This involves either circumventing, sidestepping, omitting, or merely hinting at specific elements that I recognize as precarious territory, ensuring they are absolutely accurate and appropriate.
Let's stick with that. An imperial commission comes forward, and they write a very comprehensive report concerning the Jewish population. And this imperial commission's report from 1669 or around that time, is that historically accurate?
Yes, it is historical.
If you say it's historical, then I absolutely must read a passage from it because it genuinely astonished me. It states, "It is beyond dispute that Jews poison wells, desecrate consecrated hosts, abduct Christian boys, circumcise them, and raise them in the Jewish faith, instruct girls to become witches, devastate fields with frost and hail, and conjure swarms of locusts. I'll tell you why that truly astounded me. These are precisely the classic anti-Jewish stereotypes from the medieval period, the same ones that were prevalent back then. However, we're in the year 1669, and I had thought, well, they're simply adopting these long-held clichés that originated in the Middle Ages and carrying them forward. On the other hand, it occurred to me that the last witch to be burned in the Prince-Archbishopric of Salzburg met her fate in 1750. That's a full 100 years later, and among the accusations levied against her was that she had flown to a witch's Sabbath. On a broomstick, or however it might have been. So, this indicates that there are certainly some murderous prejudices that come from the Middle Ages, but are incredibly lasting.
Yes, perhaps just one more, a small side note, if you will. I think I invented the plot about the locusts. You know how it is. The video goes online and then, I don't know, 10 historians or those who think they are show up. The commission actually wrote that, and that was in 1669 on the topic of the Middle Ages. Well, you see, there's quartering. That's what was practiced, for example, in England, which was also an absolutely incredibly brutal form of execution, hanging someone until they were nearly choked but not quite to death. And then you're dismembered alive. This was still done until the early 19th century. So while we have that, on the other hand, in the 17th century we have an Isaac Newton, we have a Galileo Galilei, but we also have Giordano Bruno, who was burned at the stake in 1600. This means that we are, and this was also what I found so utterly fascinating about this novel, and what I truly wanted to convey, this profound overlap between the deepest, most cliched Middle Ages that we often envision, and the nascent modernity already, so to speak, sharply intruding and interfering within this actually very brutal period. A time with climate change and everything else that was part of that era. And so this transitional period, this profound ambivalence too regarding what people were thinking, their attributions and their prevailing ideas, it's very modern and in a way that makes this historical novel relevant today, especially concerning anti-Semitism.
Let's rather stick with the questions of probability then. Within the pages of this novel, we encounter a rather disturbing clerical network operating in Vienna, deeply involved in the molestation of boys. That may or may not have happened. It really doesn't matter, it's a novel after all. However, within this context, Bishop Cologny is also featured. He's a historical figure, and as a child molester, he encounters a most severe misfortune, which, quite frankly, one wholeheartedly feels he deserved, given his heinous actions. And then there's Prince Bishop Breuner, who is interred in St. Stephen's Cathedral. The novel states that he secretly watched the abuse of boys through a peephole, observing these acts of defilement from his hidden vantage point. I watched the whole thing, and when I read that, I couldn't help but think to myself, this is quite bold. That's bold. Can you do that in a novel?
Well, yes. I would assume that it is permissible. Firstly, given the very extensive time frame in this particular instance, considering the significant amount of time that has already elapsed. So we find ourselves, we are living in a time 350 years ago. These individuals in question all of them are long dead. And from a historical perspective, given their anti-Semitism, their significant role in the Counter-Reformation, and numerous other actions they undertook, I do not consider them to be particularly worthy of protection. But when I look back to the 17th century, I think, well, that's a literary license that I should be allowed. And above all, as you correctly point out, yes, it is audacious, but it's not entirely out of the realm of possibility when one considers the numerous cases of child abuse that we've become aware of over the past several decades, indeed the last 50, 60 or even 70 years, cases that have truly come to light and are publicly known. That happened within or in the vicinity of the Catholic Church. And one can, quite realistically, assume that 350 years ago it wasn't any better. In fact, it was probably much, much worse.
Good. All right, this spiritual network of child molesters, I definitely thought to myself, I can absolutely imagine that, and the author is completely at liberty to include it. But with two historical figures, I was a bit more skeptical. However, I would like to cite another passage in this regard, and that is where you state, "No one despises Jews more intensely than the university students in Vienna." It was true in the past, and will likely remain so in the future. Firstly, that's a statement from 1670, and secondly, that very sentence already includes a foreshadowing, because 100 years ago, in the 1920s of the 20th century, it was primarily the students at the University of Vienna, including female students, as young women were also part of that group, who spearheaded the National Socialist anti-Semitism movement even before the Nazis rose to power in Germany. And that was indeed a racist, because it was a National Socialist hatred of Jews. But of course it became intertwined with this age-old Christian hatred of Jews.
Regarding the students, I must say that this passage didn't just spring from my imagination. On the contrary, it was precisely the students of the University of Vienna who, before the expulsion of the Jews in 1670, marched into the Jewish quarter several times during the 1660s, along with others. However, they were very significantly involved, often as ringleaders, and for a variety of reasons, it would be too extensive to elaborate on the specific triggers now for why they wanted to invade. They attempted to organize a pogrom, which the authorities at the time sometimes managed to prevent, at least in part. It was Emperor Leopold himself, who also didn't want the Jewish population to be simply massacred by the populace. And the students were already like that back then. It surprised me too that they were so into it. But yes, that's correct. And back then, of course, it was strictly male students, not female students, as became common in the 1920s and 30s. It's there that I took the liberty of this anticipation. Well, I certainly had that in mind, especially during the interwar period when this specific kind of racist anti-Semitism was incredibly prominent within academic spheres, and naturally it then permeated and spread throughout society as a whole.
Now we come to the topic of the... Now let's talk about the character of the personal physician. The Empress's Jew, that is actually the title. This Pedro is a converso. You should really explain that term to the audience, shouldn't you?
Yes, he is a converso. As the term itself already suggests, it comes from to convert, meaning someone who has converted. So it wasn't him personally, but rather his ancestors, many generations before him, who converted to Catholicism, that is, to Christianity, specifically embracing the Catholic faith. Alternatively, they were forcibly baptized or compelled to undergo baptism during a brutal pogrom. In Spain, at that particular time, people of different faiths were no longer allowed to be present. They were no longer tolerated there. Even the Protestants, the few who were present, had either been expelled or had converted. And the Moors, meaning the former Muslims who remained after the conquest of Granada, and also the Jews as well. The Jews who didn't want to convert had emigrated. They were in fact already expelled back in 1492. Those who chose to remain, however, were still widely regarded as Marranos. Marranos, meaning pigs, that's what they were called, because people didn't actually believe that they had converted to Catholicism out of true inner conviction. And that wasn't often the case. Often they were what you might call crypto-Jews, just like my personal physician in the novel. He appears to be Christian only on the surface. He attends church, goes to confession, but all of it is merely for show. In reality, he is still a Jew, and he also has a private room somewhere where he then, so to speak, performs his rituals.
But the Empress knows it, and despite all her intense hatred for Jews, she is utterly dependent on him as her personal physician, and therefore she tacitly acknowledges this situation without saying a word. What particularly interested me about that, this Pedro, the Empress's personal physician, is scorned and ridiculed by the university professors of medicine here. Indeed, they look down upon him with utter disdain. That's because he stands against the prevailing medical science of his era. This means he's talking about bathing, washing, and getting fresh air. However, all of that stands in complete opposition to the established medical doctrines and teachings prevalent in 1670. And I asked myself, was it possible for someone to think so much against the prevailing zeitgeist at that time? In a novel, that's fine, but is it actually plausible?
I certainly think so. There have always been individuals who were different, those who were truly ahead of their time. And what's more, in his case, and this makes the whole thing for me, and it's even more realistic than one might initially believe. As you rightly state, anything is possible within a novel. However, it's not completely baseless, because he never attended university. Instead, he is a wound doctor, a military surgeon. Yes, he was also in the 30 Years' War. Those were individuals who were skilled craftsmen at the time. And it was what we would now call training on the job. That means these were people who, through trial and error, rather than through academic theories, arrived at their conclusions. He had been in the war, and he simply observed what truly worked and what didn't. And his father was exactly the same way. In that regard, it makes it even more realistic to me, because he simply observed what was effective through trial and error, perhaps without being able to intellectually or scientifically articulate why it worked. And when you want to save someone's life in a war where thousands are dying, you definitely come to understand what works and what absolutely doesn't.
Regarding the subject of water, I recall reading somewhere that Louis XIV, who was a contemporary of Emperor Leopold I, supposedly bathed only 3 times in his entire life, and even then he did so with great reluctance. And also, as we know, people absolutely drenched themselves in perfume since they stank so terribly. So, it's definitely possible, and I want to provide another example from the novel, where I myself, I really racked my brains trying to figure out the actual probability of what happened. A duel takes place, and during this duel, due to an unforeseen chain of events and circumstances, this Pedro, he actually strikes his duel opponent's head off. Head clean off. That means he beheads him. Now, as we are well aware, that kind of outcome was absolutely not common practice in duels. And it was in that context that I was reminded of a truly wonderful book, a conversation between Hitchcock and François Truffaut. And in this conversation, Hitchcock informs Truffaut that he doesn't allow probability in his films to, and I quote verbatim, rear its ugly head. And I thought to myself, that's a perfectly fitting concept for the world of art.
I've dwelled on that particular scene for quite some time, as it's admittedly not very realistic in nature, yet it remains entirely plausible. That, of course, is my artistic license, that it actually happens. Well, probably something like that just wouldn't have been possible. I do admit that.
As Hitchcock says, one shouldn't allow probability to rear its ugly head and ruin the story's dramatic impact.
Right.
All right then, To conclude, Leopold I was certainly musically and artistically inclined. He composed music and organized magnificent festivals for which the Viennese absolutely adored him. He even had I read in your novel that he had an artificial lake constructed right there in the castle courtyard, and ships actually sailed straight through it within the castle grounds. And moreover, he actually defeated the Turks, even though he was not present during the siege of Vienna in 1683. He and his family were not personally in Vienna. But nevertheless, the Turks were defeated, and Hungary was successfully reconquered. Under the reign of Leopold I, Austria truly transformed into a formidable great power. And as you briefly hinted at, in that era, even prior to the massive expulsion, there were always these recurring violent assaults on the Jewish quarter and the emperor. Emperor ordered an immediate halt to those attacks, and he had the ringleaders of those attacks summarily executed. This implies he was a contradictory figure.
Absolutely. So this figure of Leopold, of Emperor Leopold, is definitely not unsympathetic to me at all. I genuinely find that he was a very contradictory and, in some ways, quite a tragic figure. In some respects, he was very successful. Ultimately, from his perspective, yes. From a modern perspective, one might now ask, is establishing a great power truly a desirable goal? However, from his own perspective, and indeed from that of his contemporaries, he was undeniably an incredibly successful emperor. He was no great hero, he truly wasn't. He actually fled from the plague, which, approximately a decade after the time I'm discussing, genuinely decimated and depopulated various sections of Vienna. Then came the plague column, and shortly after that, the siege of Vienna. So that was two catastrophes, one right after the other. He basically said his goodbyes, so to speak, and fled the city. He wasn't a great military leader either. That he delegated. That's when Prince Eugene rose to great prominence. But he was quite intelligent. He knew exactly where his limits were, and he was also, naturally, he scorned and utterly detested Jews, and without a shadow of a doubt, he was an anti-Semite. But he also wasn't, a second Hitler or Stalin, someone who wanted to completely eradicate or simply annihilate them entirely from existence. He also had his court factors, his, so to speak, court Jews, who were the ones financing his various wars too. And he knew perfectly well that he needed them for the economy as well. So in that sense, he was quite the pragmatist. An absolutely contradictory figure, yes. Deeply on one hand, he was very devout. He was constantly praying, he was a deeply devout man, yet simultaneously he was a pragmatist who truly understood the implications of realpolitik. And for that time it also wasn't always self-evident.
Finally, the book explores the profound question of why, as a distinct people, the Jewish people have managed to endure throughout history. And that is indeed a profound question, especially when one considers, for instance, the tumultuous migration period with tribes like the Lombards, the Vandals, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, and countless others. All of them simply vanished. But the Jewish people still exist, and I mean they've endured throughout history, resisting countless attempts to erase them. Until the second half of the 19th century. That is something we can see. Is completely and totally attributable to their religion. But that would undoubtedly ignite an entirely new conversation. And for this one, I extend my sincere gratitude to you for this opportunity.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation and for the conversation.
Mena Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Think Tank. Besuchen Sie auch unsere Website Dort finden Sie täglich neue aktuelle Berichte und ausführliche wissenschaftlich fundierte Hintergrundanalysen zur Geschichte und Gegenwart der Mena-Region.